All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to our National Road Safety Partnership Program webinar, Talking Sense, Why Language is the Key to Safety. This webinar is brought to you by the NRSSP in partnership with the Australian Road Research Board and SenseMap. Now, Jerome Castlake will be your moderator this session, and Jerome manages the NRSSP and its many activities. Welcome, Jerome.
Thank you very much, Rosemary.
And you're normally in the studio with me today, but where are you?
At the moment, I'm sitting up in a little country town in New South Wales in the high mountains. So I'm taking this as a great opportunity to be part of the webinar.
Fantastic. And you were going to tell us a little bit about the NRSSP.
Certainly. For those who don't know, the National Road Safety Partnership Program, or NRSSP, has been established to provide a collaborative network for Australian businesses and organisations to help them create a positive road safety culture, both internally and externally. It aims to help organisations of all sizes, across all sectors, to share and build road safety initiatives specific to their own workplace and beyond. It's delivered by ARB and funded primarily by a government coalition and ARB. So for more information and more tools like this webinar, please refer to the NRSSP website and please register for the newsletter to be kept up to date on future events. And just one last point. It's great to have this webinar and to go into Brett because I think it's a great addition to Safe Work Month.
Thank you, Jerome. And today's webinar will go for approximately 45 minutes with 15 minutes for question time throughout. We have a fairly big audience, so if we don't get to all our questions, we might be able to email some of the key ones later. And we do love to hear from our audience, so please ask questions and share your experiences. Now, our presenter today is Brett Rutledge from SenseMap. Welcome, Brett.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, Brett. And where are you from today? Where are
Hi,
you
everyone.
sitting?
I'm in Melbourne today.
Great.
Sitting in my office.
Awesome. And we've got a slight delay, so that's why our audience would have heard a slight delay, but we're not worried about that. And we're so lucky to have you, and thank you for your time. And about you, Brett. So Brett is a former world champion of public speaking and an internationally regarded business strategist, linguist, and communication expert. He has acted as a key advisor on the language, meaning, and structure of some of the most important commercial deals undertaken in Australasia, working with many high-profile individuals and organisations to change the way they are perceived, valued, and respected. So let's get going, Brett. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Rosemary. Welcome, everyone. Today's session is all about language, and essentially I'm a business linguist. So what I do is I look at everything from the point of view of language. And language is really at the core of everything we're about. One of the key concepts that we want you to understand today is that language is identity. It's one and the same thing. So words not only express what you think, they actually shape how you think. And what I mean by that is that if I were to get any of you to write down an opinion on some subject at length, so you're writing your full opinion, you're figuring out exactly what you think about a particular subject and writing that down on a page. As you wrote that opinion down, you would actually alter the opinion. That's how powerful language is, because as you saw the words coming up in front of you, you'd be sitting there going, oh, that's not quite what I meant, or I've forgotten to mention this, or now I've found a contradiction, I'm not sure how that works out. So language literally shapes the way that you think, and that's why we pay so much attention to it across different areas of business, around society and culture and so on. One of the fastest ways to change behaviour, and arguably the fastest way, is to change the language that's being used. Because when you're surrounded by a particular set of words, that forces you to think in that particular way, and then ultimately that forces you to behave in that particular way. So when you're looking at trying to improve safety, for example, you have to pay close attention to the language you're using to describe and express what's important about safety, because that in turn will change the way that people think about safety and ultimately the way that they behave about safety. Language is that important, and it's an area that we don't generally pay a lot of attention to in the business world. We tend to ignore the core language that governs everything that we say and do. To give you an idea of just how important it is, bilingual people, and I'm sure there's a number of you out there today listening into the webinar, understand this. My wife speaks fluent French. Now, when she starts speaking French, it's not enough for her to simply change the language that's coming out of her mouth. She has to change the way that she thinks as well. She has to start thinking in French. The structure's different. The syntax is different. The idioms are different. Literally changing the way you think is the key to being able to speak another language. And when you don't do that, that's when you get into trouble. When my wife starts speaking French, but she's still thinking in English, that's when she starts to make mistakes. That's when people laugh at her. That's when she says things that sound a bit weird in that particular language. And everyone's had that kind of experience. I often get asked, because my wife speaks fluent French, if I speak fluent French as well. The answer to that is no, because then I'd have to speak to my wife, and that's not good for either of us. But the point is that if you've grown up speaking a particular language, then you are hardwired to think differently to someone who grew up speaking another language. It's that powerful. And that makes perfect sense when you consider how different languages can be. And I'll give you an example. Most of us today listening in obviously speak English, and probably most of us grew up in Australia or another English-speaking country not too far away, and that has formed our thinking experience. So to give you an example of how this can permeate and how quickly it can start to cause problems, English is written left to right. So we're taught from a very early age to scan and think from left to right. That's how we interpret our environment. That's how we look for things, left to right. When you're crossing the road, for example, the classic thing that we all teach our kids, what do we say to them? Look left, then right, then left, then right again. Always left to right. That's English. Now, if you are someone who speaks Arabic, if you grew up with Kurdish, if you're speaking Hebrew as a child growing up, or Urdu, as many people in Pakistan and India do, then you've grown up right to left, the opposite direction. You interpret your world right to left, because that's how your language is formulated. And you think about the impact that that has, how difficult it is to literally change from left to right to right to left. If you want to experiment with this, just try, if you're right-handed, try writing with your left hand. See how that goes. See how difficult that is to do, to master. Try tying your shoelaces in a different way. Try looping the other side of the shoelace to the one you would normally do. It's a very, very weird thing, and it requires an enormous amount of concentration. And when that concentration slips, that's when you start to get into trouble and you start to get confused. Does that make sense to you, Jerome?
Oh, it does. I was just thinking about when I try and brush my teeth with my left hand from time to time and try and stimulate the brain, I finish up hurting my gums. So totally agree.
So language is identity. It actually informs just about everything there is about you. One of the things that you often see with footballers, for example, that we see here in Australia a lot, is they say something stupid. They say something that embarrasses them in some way, whether it's a derogatory comment about someone based on race or based on gender, whatever it may be. One of the first things they'll come out when they apologise, usually on national television, is they'll say, "That's not me. That's not who I am. Those words do not represent the way that I think or the person that I am." Now, as a linguist, I know that's not true. The words can't come out of your mouth unless at some level that is exactly who you are. So what they're really saying is that my language is not who I want to be, but it is absolutely who you are. Language is identity. It's that important.
So just drawing on that point, Brett,
Yep.
when you're talking about the language and the identity, and I guess when you put things out there, quite often when there's Christmas functions coming up, or you're out and about with people and they get a few drinks in them, and all of a sudden they start talking a little bit differently, and you start hearing things and it can shock you a little bit. Is that more the person inside or their mind? What's your comments on that?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it is. What you're seeing in those situations is someone who's been allowed to have their inhibitions stripped away. So normally social conventions will stop us from saying certain things. There are normally things that we all experience this. There are things that we think or believe that we know is not appropriate to say in that particular circumstance. And it's not necessarily something that's wrong. It might be because we know it's going to upset someone or hurt someone's feelings or create an incident or whatever it may be. So that social convention stops us from, putting sound to the words, if you like. What happens when you've had alcohol and you're drunk is you're stripping those inhibitions away. Now, alcohol is not the only thing that does that, of course. Money does it as well. Anything that allows you to feel safe, anything that allows you to feel like you're untouchable in some way will strip away the inhibitions and allow you to start saying out loud what you're really thinking. If I can use the vernacular a little bit here, there's an old saying that, money changes people. Money doesn't change people. Money, for example, does not make you an unpleasant person. What money allows people to do is see you more readily for what you are, because you feel more comfortable in your skin, you feel like you're above them or that you have more power, and as a consequence, you worry less about what comes out of your mouth. And alcohol is a classic example of that. So the other concept that I want you to get your heads around today, because I want you to look at your business, I want you to look at your safety policies and programs, not from the point of view of a health and safety professional or from a business person's perspective or a line manager's perspective or whatever it is, the role that you might fulfill in your organization. I want you to look at it from the point of view of a linguist. I want you to look at the language you're using, because once you do that, you will never look at it the same way again. So the first concept that you need to understand is language is identity. The second concept you need to understand is language is design. These two things are inseparable. Now, for example, when you write a word down on a piece of paper, you've written that in a font. It may be a font of your own making, but it's a font nonetheless. It is a design. And the key thing to understand here is that language without design can't actually be shared in any sort of meaningful way on any kind of scale. So when you're trying to get a message out to lots and lots of people, you cannot do that without design. On the flip side, design without language has no meaning. And one of the problems that we have with things like safety programs and policies and so on is that they get formulated. So the language gets done, if you like, to whether it's done poorly or whether it's done well, doesn't matter. But the design element doesn't come till much, much later. And what you end up with is people trying to communicate your program or your policy who were not involved in formulating that program or policy. So they don't understand the thinking that sits in behind it. They don't understand where you went, where you didn't go, what you decided would work or wouldn't work, and what the reasons were behind it. They then try to interpret whatever you've ended up with into some kind of communication. And usually that is completely divorced from the reality of the situation. So to give you a very simple example, if you think to a common Australian example, the CBA Bank. The CBA was the biggest of the big four. They are the dominant bank in Australia. And for years and years, they had a very successful campaign, which was Which Bank? And you'll all be familiar with that. Those of you who have been in the country for a number of years, you would have seen the ads. Which bank was a rhetorical question that sat on the end of every ad. And what it said was, you don't need the answer because everyone knows the answer. There's only one. It's us. It's the CBA. There's a little bit of arrogance attached to it. It embodied them beautifully. They dumped that and they went to dare to be different as their second sort of expression, their design, if you like. Now, they're the biggest of the big four. They're the benchmark for sameness. There's nothing particularly different about them. There's certainly nothing terribly daring about them in this day and age. It didn't fit them at all. Their people hated it because it was so far divorced from their reality. And this is what happens when you try to separate language and design. You get these kinds of disconnects that people really struggle to identify with and buy into. So what we're saying to you, as much as possible in your programs, you should be involving everyone that's important, and in particular your communication people, your design people, right at the very beginning. You should be thinking about how we're going to communicate this at the start, not leaving it as an afterthought or the next stage in the process much, much later on.
So I got a good question here for you, Brett, from Tony. I think it's a good time to feed this one in. How much is language influenced by behaviour or vice versa? They go hand in hand, presumably. A large portion of safety practices influenced by our behaviours and attitudes. How much does our behaviour come into play with our language?
Yeah, there's a symbiotic relationship in a lot of ways, but language in practical terms comes first. You have to be able to formulate the thought before you can act on it, if that makes sense. So language is the thing that we tend to ignore. We focus on the behaviour because that's far more visible and often has a more immediate impact. So behaviour gets all the attention, but it's actually language that drives it. If you want to change the behaviour, the easiest way to do it is start changing the language. If you can make safety part of the conversation, you're a long way ahead. And one of the problems we have, of course, is because we separate language and design, we take this attitude, well, we're going to put posters on the wall. We're going to surround you with the messaging that we want you to understand, but we're not going to make it part of your everyday conversation, which would obviously be far more powerful. If your own people start talking about safety and its importance and why it matters and how it matters and what we're supposed to do about it, you don't need the poster at that point. So it's language first. So the third concept that I want you to understand, context is king, all right? Everything is about context. And if we don't take the time to explain our context, in other words, if we don't take the time to explain what we mean by something, what's going to happen is that someone else will bring theirs. And at that point, it's too late. You've already lost. Now, Jerome has got a story that he was telling me about a Dutch researcher, which is a classic example of how this works. I'll let you tell it, Jerome.
Great, thanks, Brett. Small story. So, Australian Road Research Board, we had some Dutch researchers come out a while ago. They were over in Victoria for a few weeks. Just to make them feel welcome, one of my colleagues went, because they were here for a weekend, colleague went, look, why don't you guys come over and join us for a good Aussie barbecue? They were wrapped in the opportunity, the three of them. They looked, well, what should we bring? His remark was, bring a plate, and we'll see you at say, 12 o'clock on Saturday. So, done, dusted. Tradition, that's how you bring a plate along to a barbecue.
Yeah, and you can imagine how weird the Dutch thought we were. Why would we bring a plate? Don't they have paper plates? Don't they have something that they can use? Why wouldn't they provide one? Wouldn't that be easier? They're probably sitting there thinking, wouldn't it be more sensible to bring some food? And this is the problem, is that because in that situation, no one took the time to explain what they meant by bring a plate. The Dutch brought their own interpretation of it, and it was quite a literal interpretation. Now, it's easy to think that this is just an example of an idiom. It's slang. It's just a word that's being used that we don't particularly, that they don't have an equivalent of. But the real issue is not that at all. What's happening here is that we tend to use words as if they have universal meanings. We tend to treat them as if they are labels that will be universally understood by everyone. And the reality is that very few words in any language have universal meanings. They typically have contextual meanings. So if you look up any word in the dictionary, what you will find are 5, 6, 7, 8, sometimes 10 different possible meanings depending on the context that that word is being used. The word safe itself has 5 or 6 different meanings. And this is something that we tend to ignore, we don't understand very well. Safe in an office is different to safe in a factory, which is different again to safe in a vehicle, which is different again to safe somewhere else. And this is really, really important. We have to learn to explain what we mean by words rather than just use the words and hope that everyone's going to get it. And it's not the jargon that trips you up. It is literally the everyday words that you use in your everyday language, that you have a vague understanding of what it may mean, and you assume that everyone else has the same vague understanding. An example of, sorry, Jerome, go on.
No, you go into your example, but just before we do, I'll give you a quick question here from Bastian as well, which I think could feed into your example. What do you think about the term body language and the importance it has been given in the corporate world?
Okay, this is where I'm going to be a little controversial. Body language is gestures, right? And we use gestures, we use body language to try to underpin the emotional content of what we're trying to communicate. It's very real because we all use it, we all apply it. But just as I said that words don't have universal meanings, as a general rule of thumb, body language doesn't have universal meanings either. There's actually no way to scientifically interpret someone's body language. It relies very heavily on context. It relies very heavily on you knowing that person. So if I fold my arms, for example, body language people will tell you that that means that you're in some way closed or defensive. And that is a possibility. It could mean that. It could also mean that I'm cold. It could also mean that I'm just comfortable doing that. It could mean that I don't really know what to do with my hands, so this was my way of solving that problem. It could be that my father did that for 40 years and I don't even realize that I do it too, as a way of copying him. It could be that my left hand is slightly deformed and it embarrasses me, so that's my way of hiding it. It could be that I'm finding the ladies in front of me very attractive and I'm pumping up the biceps and pumping up the chest and sort of saying, hello ladies, how are you? And the point is that unless you know me personally, you don't really know what that means. You're guessing. And the thing that I use as an example to answer the question, let's assume body language is true. And let's assume, as I suspect most of you have, that we've all been to body language school. And we're having a meeting and some sort of negotiation, because body language is usually taught in the context of being important in a negotiation to try and control the conversation and give you an advantage. And about halfway through that negotiation, I fold my arms. So what I'm telling you is that I'm not happy. I'm not comfortable with where this is going. I'm defensive. I'm very unhappy with where this negotiation is headed. And around about the same time, you on the other side of the desk, throw your feet up on the desk and put your hands behind your head and lean back a bit. And you've been to body language school as well, so you know that what you're saying to me is, I think it's going swimmingly. This is brilliant. It's never been better. I couldn't care less what you think. The problem is, we've both been to body language school. So I know that you know that I know that you know that I know that you know that I know that you know, which means know anything, because human beings lie. For all you know, I'm perfectly happy. I'm just going to fold my arms and push you a bit and see what happens. For all I know, you're bluffing. You've got absolutely nothing. You're just trying to look really confident and hope that you can get your way through it. And that's the problem with body language and the way that it's taught in business. If body language is true, it can be taught. If it can be taught, it can be learned. If it can be learned, it can be faked. Therefore, it's not true. And it's pretty hard to get out of that logic loop. So to come back to the idea of context is king, and how easily these things can be misinterpreted. I always use the example of the term planet, P-L-A-N-E-T. And I say to people quite often, what is a planet? And for most people, they can't answer that question. They don't actually know. They can name planets. They know they live on one. They know there's Earth, there's Mars, and so on and so forth. They might know vaguely that it has to orbit a sun, but they don't know all the conditions that make a planet a planet. And what I point out to them is that you would have used that word planet in thousands of times across your lifetime in different conversations. And the reality is, you don't know if you have ever used that word correctly. And more to the point, you don't really know if the person you were talking to ever knew what it meant either. And this is what happens when we don't take the time to explain what we mean. massive mistakes occur. The Ford Motor Company in the 70s produced a car called a Pinto. And it was quite a successful car for 1971, I think it was. And it was named the Pinto after the horse, the Pinto horse. Now, if you know anything about horses, for those of you listening, the Pinto horse is a multi-talented horse. It's generally good at most things. It can perform various tasks really well. And it also doesn't have any breed-specific health issues. It's quite a healthy horse. So as long as you give it a healthy lifestyle and feed it, look after it, it's never going to have any problems. So you can see why Ford looked at that for their little compact car and said, well, there's the Pinto horse. It does everything pretty well. It's a jack of all trades. It never breaks down. It never gets sick. That's a great name for our car. That makes perfect sense. You can see why they chose it. And it went really well for them until they tried to export it to Brazil. Because what they did was they assumed that a Pinto was a Pinto was a Pinto was a Pinto everywhere in the world. They assumed that the Pinto horse had a universal meaning, no matter where you went. And the problem in Brazil was that Pinto was also Brazilian slang for small penis. And what happened, of course, is that the Ford small penis did not sell well. There were not a lot of people lining up to buy that car. Now, it's easy to think that this is your classic mistranslation. It's a little bit funny, and that it's just a classic example of someone not translating the word properly. But the reality is, what it really is that what Ford did was they just assumed the word was a universal label that they could use no matter what. In reality, what they had was a meaning that they wanted to convey. What they should have done is said, in America, Pinto, the meaning that we're trying to convey with that word is great all-rounder, doesn't break down, reliable. What they should have done is gone to Brazil and looked for a word that meant those same things, and then they would have been fine. But that's not what we did. And that's what we mean about context is king. Now, all of us would agree that context is important. All of us understand that if you take something out of context, you get into trouble fairly quickly. The interesting thing for you to get a grasp on is that as important as this is, as this concept is, there is not a single unified academic theory of context anywhere in the world. So as important as context is, as important as language is, this is something not particularly well understood. We haven't got a handle on this. And to put that in context for you, we understand the theory of relativity. We understand black holes. We understand really complex stuff. We can map our DNA, and yet we don't really understand how context works. So don't feel bad that you often get it wrong, because the reality is everyone in the world gets this wrong on a constant basis.
So in our current multicultural society, and I got a question here from Brian, which really draws on what you've been talking about as well. In the global village that most of us operate in, translation from one language to another obviously plays a key role in getting corporate strategies, policies, etc. across international boundaries. What are your sort of thoughts as well in today's context, and how do we consider that in our multicultural society, just within Australia as well?
Yeah, it's a really difficult thing to come to grips with. The fact that you're going to have people who think differently, first and foremost, to the way that you do. That left to right, right to left thing that I was talking about, the reason that we talk about design being so important is if you've got a brochure in Arabic, the front cover is actually the back cover, right? Because it's right to left. You start at the back. You don't start at the front like we do. So the entire structure is totally different to what we're used to. So one of the really important things is that you actually have to take the time to make sure they understand what you mean. You have to have those conversations. You have to sit down with them, and you've got to be very, very careful when you're translating that you ask your translator to translate the meaning of something rather than the words themselves. They may use a completely different set of words to get across the same meaning. Again, it's what we've been talking about up until this point, this tendency to use words like labels. You can imagine the situation with Donald Trump and North Korea, for example. One of the things that no one actually talks about or considers is that neither Donald Trump or anyone in America, nor anyone in North Korea, has actually heard what the other side has said. What they've heard is an interpretation of what the other side has said. So when Trump talks, for example, and I have a number of peers in the world of linguistics, particularly in America, that would argue linguistically Trump is showing the early signs of dementia, in the sense that he can't find words, he uses the wrong words quite often, his sentences don't finish, they drift off and so on. So that's another conversation altogether. But when Trump does that, when he says something, and we can see his cadence, we can see what he's doing, we can see that he's not actually finished a sentence, he started another one, and so on and so forth. But when that gets translated for the North Korean population, they don't do that. They don't show all of that. What they do is they translate exactly what he said, but not the way he said it. And that can sound much, much harsher. And we do the same thing coming back the other way. For those of you, again, who are bilingual, who speak multiple languages, you'll see the same thing happening with subtitles in movies. My wife does this all the time. She'll be watching a French movie and she's amused at what the subtitles are saying because she knows that's not what they said in the movie. That was just the fastest, quickest way of saying the gist of what they said and getting it to fit on the screen. And it can end up being quite a different interpretation. So you really want to take the time to say, this is what we mean. This is the meaning that we want everyone to take away, and talk to you people who are involved in translation and say, what's the best way to say that in your language? Rather than give them a script and say, translate that word for word.
Well, just one other quick question here for you before we move on. Another one from Bastian. So he's a WHS manager from a large company, but they have 35% Indigenous workforce. So he tried to translate some of their docs into local language, but found it counterproductive due to the diversity of Indigenous languages. So any communication on the approach you could have really around promoting Indigenous workforce safety?
We actually have a number of clients who work very closely with Indigenous populations. And again, remember I said to you that language shapes the way you think. Indigenous people think very differently to European Australians. Their concept of time, for example, is totally different to ours. Trust is very important. And there's no quick way to deal with an Indigenous population. You actually have to take the time to meet with them face to face and talk. And not necessarily talk about what you want to talk about either. Talk about what they want to talk about until they're ready to talk about what you want to talk about. It's a very, very difficult thing to do because the discipline that's required is huge and the time and effort that's required is also huge. But you actually have to get alongside them. You have to become part of their mob, is the term they use. They don't talk about tribes, they talk about mobs. You know, it's a loose affiliation of people. And it's usually grounded in a particular geographic location as well. So the problem you're doing is you're trying to communicate with them in a European style way, and you actually have to stop and go, we have to communicate in an Indigenous way, and the Indigenous way is very much centered around storytelling and face-to-face communication. Hopefully that helps a little bit. So all of this is about meaning more, saying less, making sense. This is the mantra that you want to get into your heads. We need to concentrate on what we mean. We need to find a way to say that as simply and as quickly as we possibly can. And we need to make sure that whatever we're doing is relevant to those people and to that situation so that it makes sense to them. Typically what happens in organizations is that we don't pay much attention at all to meaning. We try to compensate for that by saying more and more. We overload people with information, and as a result, they can't see why it's relevant, and therefore it makes no sense at all. One of the problems that each of you have is that you're an expert in what you do. And when you're an expert in something, you have two issues that you bring to the party, if you like. The first one is that you think everything is important, because for you and your world it is. So when someone asks for your help, because you're a nice person and you want to help, the first thing that pops into your head, whether you realize it or not, is you think to yourself, I must make sure I include everything that's important, which is everything. And the person that you're talking to, the person you're communicating with, of course, they don't have your context. They don't have any way of being able to filter that information to figure out which bits matter to them and which bits don't. So as a result, they get overloaded. And when you're completely overloaded with information so that you can't make sense of it in any way, shape or form, what you tend to do is dismiss the whole lot. You assume all of it must be nonsense. The second problem that we have is that we speak in abstracts. And what I mean by that is that you use little phrases, little words that are academic shortcuts. And again, as we talked about before, you assume that there's a universal meaning attached to that and that everyone is going to get that. So to give you a very, very simple example, I have two boys who are currently 7 and 9 years of age. So when the youngest one was born, I had an 18-month-old toddler at home. And I had to teach that 18-month-old toddler the abstract concept of gentle. Now, if you think about this, would it matter how long I spent talking about gentle to an 18-month-old? And the answer is no, because they have no concept of gentle at all at that age. I have to show them what gentle means. I have to show them what gentle means when I touch them. I have to show them what gentle means when they touch someone else. And we have to spend the time drilling that into them. It's only once they've had that experience that they can then use the label. But the point is that it's only gentle in relation to the baby, because as they get older, gentle changes. Gentle, now that they're 7 and 9, is nothing like what it was when one was 18 months old and one was 0. And this is the point. Language evolves. It changes over time. Meanings change over time. And you have to take the time to make sure that you're getting across the meaning you want them to take from it. So that is an absolutely critical thing that you should be aiming for. If you've got screeds and screeds of information about your safety program or policy, then you've probably failed already. Who's going to read it? If they did read it, who's going to understand it? Who's going to be able to apply it to their situation? You've got to strip it back and look at things in a much more basic way so that your workforce can actually embrace this, so that they can start using that language everywhere and therefore starting to shape their thinking. And when you look at languages when you've got people who speak different languages, when you've got populations within your workforce who may not speak English very much at all, and that's not uncommon in things like manufacturing and agriculture and so on, then you've got to think very carefully about how you communicate it in a way that they will understand. Having a brochure where everything's left to right may not be much good if you've got a large, Urdu-speaking population within your workforce who are used to right to left and everything going backwards. It may mean that to eliminate that kind of problem, you've got to reduce everything down to a single image or a single word. And if you're going to do that to eliminate those left to right, right to left type problems, and you're going to make it all come down to one word that you spend all the time getting the meaning across, then you've got to be very, very careful about what that word is. So you have to pay a huge amount of attention to this. And the reality, of course, is that we just don't. So let me talk a little bit about effective communication and what it is, because this is another area where we all struggle. All of us agree that effective communication is incredibly important. This is what we're aiming for. But most of us don't understand what effective communication actually is. So while we all agree it matters, again, before today, if I said to you, tell me what effective communication is, what most of you would do is you would start talking about the kinds of things that you have to do as the communicator. So you'd say things like, well, you've got to be clear, or you've got to get feedback, or you've got to, you might have to be funny, or you've got to be engaging, or whatever it may be. And the reality is none of those things actually matter, because it's not you who decides whether or not your communication is effective. It's the person that you're communicating with that makes that decision, that makes that judgment. So effective communication is not about what you've got to do. Effective communication is about what your audience has to do. And there are 4 things that have to happen. They have to understand you. They have to agree with you. They have to care about what you're saying or communicating. and then they have to do something as a result. They have to act. Now, we judge whether or not communication has been affected by whether or not they act, whether or not they do what we wanted them to do. If they're not doing what you want them to do, if you're not getting the outcomes you're looking for, then it will always be because they either didn't understand, didn't agree, or didn't care. There are no other reasons. So it's really important that you understand that if we're not getting the outcomes we're looking for, then we've either got an understanding issue, in which case we need to go back and explain again what it is that we're trying to achieve, and not in the same way that you did previously, in a different way, because the previous way didn't work. You don't want to be like my father, who, when faced with someone who doesn't understand him, repeats what he asked word for word, but much more slowly and much more loudly than he did previously, as if that will somehow help. If you could see him on a street corner in Hong Kong asking for directions from a native Chinese-speaking person who didn't speak English, and asking the directions again by going more slowly and more loudly than he had, you'd realize how stupid that approach is. And yet that's exactly what we do in the business world, time and time again. We go back and we say exactly the same thing, but more slowly and more loudly, as if somehow that's going to help them understand. You have to go back and explain things differently to what you did the first time around, because clearly the first time round failed. If it's not an understanding issue, then it might be an agreement issue, which means you've got to go back and have an argument. And you need to win it to get the outcome you want. So you've got to go back and find out why they disagree, why they don't believe what you're talking about works or is effective or will get you the outcome you want or is practical or whatever it may be. And the interesting thing is, if you go back and have that conversation, you may find out you're wrong and they have a better way of doing it. And if they don't care, then what you have to do is you have to frame things into the context of something they already care about. You can't make them care about something that they inherently don't care about. You've got to twist it around so that it becomes something they do care about. Jerome, you were giving the example when we were chatting earlier about the TAC ad, I think it was.
Yeah, with the towards zero, with the they got the person to say, well, how many people should die on Victorian roads? And the fellow goes, 70. And then what they have is they go, well, bring 70 people, and 70 people come around the corner. And all of a sudden, the context look shock, and you actually get goosebumps because this is all recorded live. There's 70 family members of his, with his wife and daughter front and center, with all of them coming around. And all of a sudden, they ask the question again, how many people should die on Victorian roads? He's come back, 0.
Yeah. And that's because the number of 70, of course, didn't really mean anything to him. But as soon as he could see 70 friends and family, as soon as that number became something more realistic, something that he already cared about, then his entire attitude towards it changed dramatically. Now, the thing about this care thing is when we talk about caring, right, there's a natural tendency to think this is all warm and fluffy and group hugs and things like that. It's not necessarily like that. It's finding something they care about and relating what the outcome you want to it, so that that outcome becomes something they care about as well. And that might be something quite harsh. It might be, if you don't do this, we're going to fire you, for example. And if they care about their job, they're going to care about the outcome you're after as well. So don't think that this is all about being friends and joining hands around a campfire and singing Kumbaya. It isn't. It's a very practical, in some cases hard-edged approach to things. But if you want effective communication, if you want them to do what you want them to do, then they have to understand, they have to agree, and they have to care. There are no other options.
So how do you, I guess, just on that, one of the toughest groups to deal with are, say, 16 to 24-year-old young males. They're known as the bulletproof ones. It's not going to happen to me. How can you sort of, drawing on those sort of 3 points, how can we cut through to those people, do you think?
Well, again, oftentimes there's an issue around understanding. There's an issue around them thinking that this couldn't happen to me, which is the bulletproof aspect you talked about, which is an agreement issue. It may well be that they're young, they're carefree. They don't worry about themselves. in that way. If it's an understanding issue, then again, you've got to take them through and explain it in a way that they relate to. Sometimes what we do is the way that we explain these things is done in a way that people much older relate to. One of the problems that younger people have is, for those of us who are over 40, we all grew up with essentially one source of news. There would be one TV channel, one radio station, one announcer. It was always one source. So we very quickly came to trust a single source of information. In the modern age, which you've got are young people who are growing up with hundreds of sources of information, loads and loads and loads and loads. And so what we tend to do is we go there with our single source of information, which is us, and we say, well, we're older, you should trust us, we've been through this, we know what this is like. And from that younger person's perspective, they're sitting there going, but you're just another one. You're just another message in a sea of them that I hear. What we have to learn to do is justify our source. We have to find ways to say, it's not just me that says that. Look, here's another example, here's another example, here's another example. So there's a communication issue inherently in that. If you're talking about agreement and caring and those kinds of issues, then again, you've got to sit back and go, how do we find something that they can relate to already? What's something about being a young person that they can get across? And it might be something as simple, for example, that they might love surfing, right? And if you crash the car and break your leg, you're not going to be able to surf for 6 months. And it might be not being able to surf for 6 months is actually the key thing here. This is the thing that makes them worry. It's not breaking their leg. They think that's kind of cool. But not being able to do something that they love is a different matter. And you have to find whatever it is that unlocks that. You've got to think outside of that narrow definition of what safety is often thought of as. You've got to think in terms of consequences, not just consequences for their job, but consequences for them. That's what that TAC ad was very much about. It says here's your 70 people when suddenly you know them. And now it's a different question and it's a different answer. Mother Teresa probably said it best. She said, if you show me an entire village of starving people, my reaction will be, well, that's terrible, but I'm one person. What could I possibly do? How could I possibly help? There's nothing I can do as one person when you've got hundreds who are starving somewhere. But if you show me one starving child, my reaction will be, how can I not help? How can I not be involved? And that's why people like World Vision get you to sponsor a single child. Now, the reality is that's not how it works. It's not as if they're going into a village somewhere in Africa and saying, good news to one child, you've been sponsored, here's your water for the day. And to another child, sorry, you don't get any water, maybe next week, fingers crossed. That's not how it works. But the reason they portray it that way is because you need that connection. You need to be able to think that you're helping someone in particular in order to be able to connect and feel like you're making a difference. If we're talking about millions of starving people, you'd all sit there going, well, this is terrible, but honestly, I'm one person, I don't earn that much, what could I possibly do? And I'm thousands of miles away. So wherever possible, with statistics, you want to reduce things to human scale. Make it about them as an individual, less about the collective, less about what happens, globally or across the country or across Victoria or across New South Wales, whatever it may be.
Just a comment here from Nigel. Nigel says, when I was an operations leader, I learned that I had to communicate in multiple ways. We had daily notes. One member of the management team would walk them around face to face. For some, emails worked. I guess these days, thinking of the young people, need to tweet or to put on Facebook as well.
Possibly, although to be fair, Facebook is more of an old person's thing these days. It's something that grandparents use to keep track of the grandkids. Younger people are on things like Instagram and so on. One of the issues with things like Instagram, things like YouTube, is that we don't actually understand them very well in terms of what they are. We often think of them as a communication tool, but primarily it's actually a search engine. So it's a way of finding information. Tweeting, look, to be honest, without Trump, I'm not sure that Twitter would still be with us. But you're right in the sense that you should be looking at multiple different channels. You should be looking at multiple ways of communicating the same message. The same meaning is probably a better way of putting it in different ways to see what gets through. And you should be measuring it too. You should be figuring out what's effective and what isn't for you. Because the reality is that even though we can talk about effective communication, we can lay it out for you and show you all the components, that doesn't mean you're going to get it right. Even those of us who understand language innately and study it and are linguists, I always say to people, this effective communication thing is a perfect construct. It makes absolute sense. It will work in your workplace, but every time I try to do it at home with my wife, disaster. So it's not, it's a nebulous thing. You have to understand this is what you're aiming for. These are the things that it directs your attention. But we're never going to be getting it right 100% of the time, all the time. There's always going to be something that goes wrong. There's always going to be someone you miss. And that's why you should be thinking about everything evolving, everything changing, meaning changing. You should be constantly revisiting that language to make sure it's still relevant today as it was 2 years ago when you dreamed it up. And this gets us to the last thing that we want you to understand is this idea of channels of communication. There are 3 channels of communication that happen simultaneously. Whenever you're talking to someone, whenever you're writing something, it doesn't matter what it is, however you're communicating, there are always 3 channels that work together. The first one is the factual channel, which is data. All right? It's that hard information. Incredibly important because, again, we are hardwired to like data. So, the people who tell you that numbers don't matter or they're not important, that is not true. They are very, very important. We look for these things. That's why we see faces in clouds. In reality, there are no faces in clouds, but we look for patterns and we find patterns wherever we look. So the lesson, of course, is that you need to provide the pattern. Otherwise, I'm going to make one up. Same thing as we talked about before. If you don't explain the context, I'm going to bring my own. So it's important that you understand this factual channel. Now, this is the one that business concentrates on the most. The problem is that in the factual channel, we tend to concentrate on it in the wrong way. We tend to provide a laundry list, if you like, of all the things that we think people should know or be aware of. I don't need you to tell me what things are. I have Google for that. I have any number of tools, all those different sources that we talked about with young people. Those are all there to tell me what things are. What I want you to do as the expert is to tell me what things mean. Your job is to interpret these things for me. Your job is to make sense of them for me. Explain to me why they matter. Explain to me where they sit in the bigger picture of things, because I don't necessarily understand that. So you have to switch your thinking. Again, context is king. Tell me what stuff means. Explain to me how this works, rather than just tell me what it is and leave the rest to me. The second thing, the second channel, if you like, is what we call the emotional channel. It is very simply feelings. And this is something that, again, we tend to strip out of our communication. We tend to pretend that it doesn't matter. You always get this idea of you don't want to get into emotional stuff. You want to keep it as factual as possible. The reality is, as human beings, we are emotional beings. Feelings are an intrinsic part of who we are. To eliminate them from a communication is ludicrous. It means you're destined to fail. If you don't share how you feel about something with an audience, there is no way they can connect with you. And if you don't take the time to acknowledge how they feel, there is no way you can connect with them. So when we're talking about safety, we have to get into the emotional stuff. We have to talk about feelings. And again, we're not talking about group hugs or anything like that. It's really, really simple stuff. If you want people to take safety seriously, then you have to take it seriously. If you want people to be happy about something, then you need to be happy about something. It's as simple as that in a lot of cases. But that emotional channel is vital. The third one is what we call the symbolic. The symbolic is everything else. It's literally all the things that we've talked about up until now. It's things like body language. It's things like colors, logos, brochures. It's policies. It's KPIs. It's anything that might impact on the truth or the veracity of what you're communicating. So we see this most often in things like movies. If you think about a movie set, everything has been placed there deliberately to evoke what they want you to feel about what you're seeing on screen. All right, if you think about those American movies where something, you know, vaguely patriotic is happening, in the background, at some point, almost invariably, there will be an American flag fluttering in a breeze. Even if it's indoors, still fluttering in a breeze. And that's the point. It's there as a symbol. Those of you who follow the space program will be aware that there's an American flag sitting on the moon. And that American flag sits out bolt upright. It doesn't droop or drop in any way. It's flying out like a breeze would be blowing. And of course, the question is how? Because it's in a zero gravity environment. It should have just fallen. It's fabric. It should have just make it to the pole no matter what. So the symbolic channel is really, really important. It's everything else. And this is where safety programs can go horribly, horribly wrong. Because if there's another program or another KPI or another policy somewhere else within the organization that contradicts safety, that says safety is not important, and if worse, if the people are actually being rewarded for following that policy more than they'd be rewarded for following a safety policy, then they're very quickly going to arrive at the conclusion that safety doesn't matter. And this happened to Delta Airlines in the 70s. Delta Airlines had planes dropping out of the sky all of a sudden in the 70s. They had a really bad crash record. And if you're an airline, obviously crashing your planes is not a good thing. And when they investigated it, what they discovered was that they had as their number one priority at Delta Airlines on-time takeoffs and landings. That was the thing that mattered most. That was the thing that everyone got rewarded for most. That was a promise they made to their customers. We will take off and land on time. We'll get you to a destination in the time frame we promised you. And because that was so important, because that was the number one priority, what was happening was that their engineers and their maintenance crews were cutting corners to get the plane out, to get the plane away from the gate on time. And as a consequence of that, they had about 4 or 5 crashes in a very short space of time over a couple of years. So it just shows you that, you know, developing your safety programs and policies in isolation is almost always fraught with problems. You've got to be thinking about what else we do across the organization. That safety language should be embedded absolutely everywhere. It should be part of the policies that sit in areas that you might think of as being totally unrelated. And those 3 channels have to work together. So the factual is your message. Tell them what stuff means. Tell them why this matters. Tell them why we're doing this. The emotional is give them a reason to care. Bind them in. Make them a part of it. The symbolic is give them a way to remember. And in some cases, that's why you have your posters. That's why you have all your little campaigns and messages and things like that. It's all about reminding them how this matters. But in speech, when we're talking to people, the symbolic channel is really simple. It's storytelling. And we need to embrace the stories. We need to be finding the great safety stories from our own people. We need to be sharing them among the other people. We should be finding the near misses and sharing those as well. When things go wrong, sharing that. The more you tell the stories about safety, the more safety becomes a part of the conversation. And as we always say is, you know, no matter what your marketing people or your clever designers or anything else come up with, at some point, anything to do with the safety program you're running or policy has to come out of someone's mouth. So why wouldn't you start there? Start with the conversation. Because if you do that, this is the result you get. If you control the language, you control the context. If you control the context, you control the result. The language you use in your safety programs, or in anything for that matter, governs everything you say and do, without exception. It's all about language. If you take the time to get your language right, you have an opportunity to explain your context to someone. If you can explain your context to someone and get them to come on board and buy into that, they will do what you want them to do. If you don't do that, then what will happen is that you'll lose control of the result. If you're getting a different result to what was intended or what you were hoping for, the reason will be because at some point along the way, you have lost control of the context. And invariably, the reason that has happened is because deeper down, you've somehow lost control of the language. That's how important it is. And we always say to people, strip it back, look again. If you can't articulate something, it's because, bottom line, you don't know what it is. That's how important language is. And that's why we encourage everyone to look at things from the point of view of a linguist. You will never look at it the same way again.
Geez, that's fantastic. Thanks, Brett. I know we're just coming up on time now, and I know we've pretty much run our hour, so thank you everyone for listening in, and we've got the final sort of slide coming up for Brett. Just before we close off, Brett, do you have a closing comment? Because we always like to get everyone to say, look, do you have a passing thought that you'd like to close out with?
I think if you've just got that mantra in your head of mean more, say less, makes sense. What does this mean? What do we mean by that? What do we want them to do? How do we say this in as short and as pithy and as simple a way as we possibly can? If everyone says to you, when you talk about safety, oh yeah, that makes sense, then you're 90% there already. And too often, our policies, our programs, everything that we do, the reality is it just doesn't make sense.
Jeez. Thank you very much, Brett. We could go on chatting for ages on this because I've got a range of other questions I'd love to table with you and things I'd love to ask you as well. So, but we are out of our allotted time. So thank you very much for coming in and talking to us. And thank you, Rosemary. So I'll just let you say goodbye and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. And Brett, we wanted to just ask you to show the last slide so Jerome can tell us about our next webinar. Over to you, Jerome.
No worries at all. My bad. I missed that one. So we do have another webinar. I'm just waiting for it to come up on the 15th of November. What happens when workers and mobile construction plants interact? So this one will be presented by Downer, and it'll be 11 to 12. So we hope you can join us for that one. And thank you once again to everyone involved, and special thanks to Brett.